John, thanks for inviting me. Thanks to the Sloan Foundation for supporting it. And although Sloan didn't support this work, it supported related work of mine, so I appreciate that very much. So this is joint work with John Leitner and Dmitry Stolyarev, both at Michigan. And we're interested in the role of annuitization and annuitized wealth in post-retirement behavior. I think, as perhaps many of you could attest from actual personal experience, late life behavior can be somewhat puzzling and hard to analyze. I meant that as personal experience as an older person, not as an analyst. But what do I mean by the puzzling aspect of it? What I mean is that we often think, at least on the research side, that thinking about retirement behavior or retirement around behavior requires structural life cycle analysis. Not always, of course, but often. And there are many puzzles that emerge when you start taking seriously those what I would call workhorse models. And here's just a list of a few fairly prominent ones. The first one is the so-called retirement consumption puzzle, a sharp decline in consumption upon retirement. I'll be focused today mostly on a post-retirement saving puzzle. Very standard life cycle models would predict a lot of decumulation of wealth after retirement. We don't see it. Very long-standing puzzles, a seeming lack of annuitization. Very simple standard model would predict that a lot of retirement wealth would be annuitized. We have difficulty identifying who and what size, who's going to make a bequest and what size it will be and what motivates it. Those are, quote-unquote puzzles. I won't put quotes around it anymore. Just, in other words, I think they are puzzles with respect to a very standard model. And an additional sort of challenge for economics research on these topics are really technical kinds of challenges that emerge from kinks or discontinuities or non-convexities, either in the budget sets or in the objective functions that make these problems just hard to analyze. I don't think this first set of claims is very controversial. The second one may be. The second claim is that the typical modeling response may be, I don't want to say too strongly, but I would say almost all modeling responses to these puzzles and to this technical challenge have either been selective in the sense that they have plucked one puzzle to analyze and to try to reconcile by itself, or have, to the extent that they've tried to address many puzzles all at once, they've been a numerical exercise to try to address these technical challenges. Or if they are analytic, they tend to be two-period and therefore obscure true dynamics. As a result, the findings that emerge from any of these kinds of studies sort of vaguely point to concerns about robustness. So how robust would it be to multiple periods? How robust would it be to alternative specifications of the model, et cetera? And more generally, as someone who's just, uses economic theory to try to understand basic drivers, I think it's challenging in this setting with either with two-period models or with relatively complex numerical ones to identify common drivers behind the puzzles and to make predictions about dynamics if you're only using two periods. So this is what I view as the challenge for theories of late life behavior, structural theories of those behaviors. So this paper in particular is part of a larger agenda that John and Dmitry and I have been working on. And here's the overall strategy. So the goal is to develop estimable, so something you can actually estimate and actually make interesting to estimate, multi-period models that are rich enough to accommodate a lot of these puzzles. Sorry, I did put quotes around it again, I'm sorry. Our second and less common goal is to maintain the analytic tractability of the model. And again, the purpose of that is to gain these more general insights that we can use to better understand, in particular, the incentives that link these puzzles together. What common incentives, what common features of the environment link what are otherwise sort of singular puzzles. And it's actually interesting to understand when they should emerge, under what circumstances and for whom. Okay? So that's our overall agenda, and we've been working on it for some time. The specifics of this paper involve these following puzzles and this sort of technical problem. So we're going to be concerned with the post-retirement savings puzzle that I mentioned before, so this evidence or lack of evidence of decumulation of assets after retirement. We also talk about the lack of annuitization and the determinants of bequests in the paper. And we address this central technical problem in thinking about retirement behavior or late life behavior created by Medicaid's guarantee of long-term care insurance. And finally, in terms of revealing common incentives that may lurk in some sense behind a lot of these puzzles, we analyze or place emphasis on the importance of portfolio and not just wealth level. The stuff in bold is what I'll talk about today, because the paper has a lot of stuff going on in it, and I'm just going to isolate a few items in order to reveal really what I see as the novelties of the model. So let's start with the puzzle that will be the emphasis of today's talk, and this is the post-retirement savings puzzle. So this has been identified for some time. This is, and even earlier than Calibration and Summers, that this central prediction of life cycle models, which is the whole reason to accumulate wealth in many respects, is to decumulate it upon retirement when we stop working. And the evidence is not, overwhelmingly in favor of that very simple prediction. So Calibration and Summers saw it in 1988. David, I think this is from your paper. I know it is. You may not have authorized my use of it, but I hope it's okay. So this is taken from David's paper in 2011. I think many of you have seen these figures. This is just looking at adjacent waves, in this case in a head cohort, the sort of oldest old in the head cohort, and looking at their liquid financial assets. So this is everything that you can imagine net of debts, but not including housing equity and not including 401k balances, because that's, I think, very difficult to measure. And the simple message here is, if you look at this, is looking at divorced or widowed between waves. This is single and adjacent waves and married and adjacent waves. But just if we look at a married couple that continues to be married, you don't see overwhelming evidence of declines wave to wave in their liquid financial assets. And this is not unique to David's findings. This is a common finding both in the US and in other developed countries. So that's the puzzle. So now let me offer a model that we're going to use to study that puzzle and others, a model of late life behavior. And let me just give you an overview of its sort of distinctive features. So we're going to focus, as is often the case, on single-person households. And I think we may as well say it out front. This is a big limitation of what we're doing, I think. So we're really isolating people who are now, sort of in the back of your mind, these are widows. And I think that's obviously a limiting aspect of what we're asking for. And I think, as we push this work further, that's going to be key to start understanding the role of married couples, or at least two people living together. So now the key uncertainty in this model is going to be take two forms. So we're obviously isolating from lots of shocks that can affect late life behavior, and focus on really two health shocks. The first is a transition from good health to low health, and that's a rise with rate lambda, small lambda. And the second shock is the subsequent, that follows it, the subsequent arrival of death. Okay, so these are Poisson transitions from one state to the next. This is the real sort of, I think, important innovation of what we're doing here, is to add means-tested public assistance, which is Medicaid nursing home expenditure. And that's how we treat it in the paper. It's really like an annuity. It's really offering a service flow, obviously, that you're using to pay for long-term care. The basic model, which is the one I'll talk about today, treats annuity income, call that A, and bequeathable assets B, as fixed upon retirement. The paper goes on to analyze, for purposes of studying the annuity puzzle, goes on to consider endogenous choice of that annuity level, but for now and for the rest of the talk, let me just assume that it's fixed. And bequeathable assets are also fixed, for the moment, in other words, given at retirement. That's another key feature. Then is also state-dependent utility. This is going to be important for thinking about the incentives created for savings late in life. So when low health arrives, remember, so you start retirement in good health, you're hit by this shock that leads you to low health, which will eventually lead to death. The state-dependent utility brings higher marginal utility. The level of utility may be lower, but the marginal utility of consumption expenditure is going to be higher. So even though you may not, obviously you would pay to avoid getting sick, your level of utility is lower, the marginal utility of consumption is going to be higher. Okay, and I'll show you how that works in the model in a second. Okay, and finally, in some sense, for purposes of seeing how far we can get in explaining savings behavior late in life, we're going to turn off the bequest motive. So the only bequests here are going to be accidental. And let me highlight here just very quickly the technical issue that, in case this is unfamiliar, the technical issue created by the Medicaid floor. So in other words, we're going to have this offer of a means-tested floor on consumption expenditure. And the problem with that, and this is basically a depiction of utility in a second period of a two-period model. So suppose you're thinking about, how much do I want to save for the next period, and this is your utility function from that consumption in the second period. So this is what it would look like in the absence of the floor, but then you have this guaranteed minimum that's made available so long as you pass the means test. So this creates now this not typically concave utility function, but now that it exhibits non-convexities. In other words, it's going to have all kinds of difficulty analyzing it, of course, just using our typical toolkit, but also creates lots of behaviors that you think are at least puzzling, if not normally undesirable. In particular, you'd see risk seeking over these intervals. Okay, so this is the technical issue that we need to confront as well. Additional assumption, and I think in the interest of time, I'll just make this very quick. The additional assumptions are really important verification problems that, with the bottom line is that we want to, A, distinguish between health problems per se, medical problems, and what we're going to call health status, which we think of as basically, using the terminology that I think, at least I know best from the health and retirement study, as activities of daily living. So this is basically, challenges with taking care of things like bathing or eating, dressing or walking across the room. So these are things that we view as likely harder to verify than certain medical conditions. And as a result, we're going to take this very extreme assumption, which is that verification problems mean there's no long-term care insurance, or really equivalently in our model, no annuities conditioned upon health status. Okay, that's obviously a very extreme assumption. I understand that long-term care insurance market is relatively thin, but it's not non-existent. But this is where we're starting from. I think future work should certainly relax that assumption. Okay, now remember this assumption about state-dependent utility. I think Ron gave me a confused face on that, which is good. So think of, again, there's two health statuses. When you're in good health and retired, you can think of your utility from expenditure as the sort of the usual isoelastic utility function, very standard. But when you get sick, but not dead, when you get sick, your utility function changes, where you now have this omega on the inside. And omega is going to be something, less than 1. But as you see, if it enters with this, if it enters this aggregation function with a number smaller than 1, that increases. Obviously, you don't feel good as a result of having this shock, but it increases the marginal utility of consumption. Does that make sense? So that you've just basically taken every dollar's worth of expenditure and reduced its level in some sense. And as with the usual curvature, now the marginal utility has just increased. So the same dollar's worth of expenditure doesn't give you quite the same boost in terms of utility because you're sick. Okay? So I'll skip over that and just talk about how that might help you with estimation to understand the curvature of the utility function, but we can skip over that. Okay. So we begin with the end. So this is the phase in which you're already become sick, all right? And in particular, I want to look at a case that's especially simple, where the annuity income that you arrived at with in retirement exceeds the value to you of that Medicaid equivalent expenditure. In other words, think about the annuity value that you retired with as exceeding whatever value you might get from actually taking Medicaid. This is especially simple, and so the problem is really easy. You're just sort of choosing consumption expenditure over time, and maybe the only sort of interesting part or distinctive part is this additional discount factor created by the hazard of death, okay? So obviously many people would interpret time discounting as reflecting uncertainty about the end of life, and here it's just an additional factor. And so as a result, optimal consumption is going to follow this very familiar formula reflecting the difference between the rate of return on assets and this sort of effective time discount factor, including both subjective time discounting and this hazard of death. And then that's obviously mitigated by this intertemporal elasticity of substitution. So the more curvature you have, the less willing you are to allow your consumption to rise or fall. That's very standard. And now here's really, and this is a big room and the screen is relatively small, so you could actually miss it very quickly. This is the solution to the technical challenge raised by the Medicaid floor. And it's really, we sort of passed over it very quickly. We've put this into continuous time. That seems sort of innocuous. And so how do you deal with this possibility that you have a consumption floor? You deal with it by adding a choice variable. And the choice variable is, now you don't have just consumption, you also have a time at which you have exhausted your wealth, and now you just go on Medicaid. So I suppose it seems kind of obvious, not a big deal, but this, it turns out, solves the problem of the non-convexity that would otherwise emerge in a discrete time framework. It makes this kind of, I don't know, a very standard, this is not a new problem anymore. This is what we call a free endpoint problem, and it's pretty standard for optimal control. And so that opens a lot of doors for analytic tractability. And here's what those solutions look like. So this is somebody in that first stage where he has plenty of annuity income, so that doesn't have to worry about Medicaid as a possibility. Again, think about this as someone who's already in poor health and is just spending down assets. The prediction, given subjective time discounting and this risk of death, is that consumption declines until it arrives at this constrained point where you're just eating your annuity income. That's it. So you had some assets, you ate them down, and then at some point, a point you've chosen, you no longer use your bequeathable wealth and just eat your annuity income. Okay, so that's the person whose annuity income exceeds what he would get from the Medicaid guarantee. And this is the other kind of person, someone whose annuity income isn't sufficient to achieve this Medicare or Medicaid guarantee, I'm sorry. And for that person, you see this decline to some level of consumption expenditure, and then this discontinuous jump down to the Medicaid guarantee. Okay, and this turns out not to be a difficult problem to handle anymore. So even though this discontinuity, we haven't skirted it, we haven't made it, assumed it away. It's really just the technical aspect that allows it to be easy to analyze. So that's the end of life. Now let's go back to this previous period. So when you were in good health, but retired. So now this is the problem you're solving, and it's relatively straightforward. The first part is that same kind of problem where you're just trying to choose consumption expenditure over this period to maximize this effectively weighted sum of consumption. And then here's that value function from before, which is just the probability. So lambda is the probability you enter poor health, and then big V is that value function associated with the problem I just solved. Okay, so this is also quite tractable and otherwise conventional. Okay, so here's what you can learn from it. And it turns out the behavior is quite rich and involves a lot of interactions, both with interest rates on assets, but also with annuitized income. So for whom does this phase diagram apply? This is the optimal behavior, describes optimal behavior for someone who's actually well annuitized. In other words, this is someone who can have sufficient annuity wealth, or you want to think of this as some pension, plus of course Social Security wealth, and Medicare for that matter. So that form of consumption is sufficiently high that they will not rely on Medicaid anytime. Sorry, I can't see the clock. Okay. So that's someone in that category, and this is also someone facing relatively low interest rates. That's less important for our purposes right now. So if it's been a while since you've looked at a phase diagram, just as a reminder, the horizontal axis here is the level of bequeathable assets. Remember, we're distinguishing between annuitized wealth and sort of liquid or bequeathable assets. So that's the level of bequeathable assets on the horizontal axis. The vertical axis gives simply the level of consumption and expenditure at any given time. And the question that we're asking is, how does this system move? How does it change on the optimal path? And so what are these dark lines? These are so-called isoclines. So that describes where parts of the system are static. So this line here is where assets aren't moving. So the level, so the change in bequeathable assets is fixed. So it's not moving at all. So B dot is 0. And this sort of equivalent for consumption expenditure. So along that isocline, consumption expenditure is not changing. So just to sort of fix ideas, think about this point right here. So this is a point where X is at some level, and assets are at 0, and also assets aren't changing. So what form of consumption does that mean? That has to mean you're eating all of your annuity income. You have no assets, so it's not producing any income. Assets aren't changing, and X is fixed. Therefore, you must be consuming your annuity income. Okay, so that's just for reference. Now, what does the dotted line describe? The dotted line describes optimal behavior, and the arrows describe where X and B are moving simultaneously. And so what this tells you is if you arrive at retirement at a level of annuity income that is too high relative to this bequeathable asset, you will accumulate bequeathable assets. You will save. Okay, so this is someone who has plenty of annuitized income. They're not really worried about needing Medicaid. It's not going to happen. They're not going to use it. And yet they arrive at retirement and start saving. So what are they doing? Why are they doing it? The reason that they're saving is because they anticipate poor health later. And what happens with poor health? You get sick, and your marginal utility from consumption rises. So effectively, they're shifting consumption from now in good health and retirement to later in bad health and retirement to take advantage of those additional marginal utilities from consumption later. That's why they're saving. These guys have arrived at retirement, in some sense, over liquid. They have too much savings, and they want to do the opposite. They want to achieve this, and so they'll do something much closer to what we would predict, at least over the short term, bring themselves down to a constant level, a level of stasis in that level of bequeathable assets. Okay, so if you're interested in the retirement savings puzzle, it's these kinds of folks who arrive a little bit over annuitized at retirement. You can ask yourself how realistic that seems. Now that's one group of agents. Let's give you another sort of piece of optimal behavior depending on the circumstances of these individuals. And this is a different circumstance where now we're interested in people who are under annuitized in the sense that they anticipate that if they run out of money in poor health, they're actually going to need Medicaid. They're going to rely on it, okay? And so the same kind of picture, but there's a very important difference between this threshold B now. So look at, to the left of that threshold B, these are people who come into retirement with insufficient assets in the following sense. They don't anticipate being able to buy themselves out of anything with respect to reliance on Medicaid upon the arrival of poor health. So they're just going to eat themselves down, ideally down to annuity level before arriving in poor health. Then poor health arrives and they turn to Medicaid. So these folks are dis-saving, kind of as you might predict, in anticipation of relying on Medicaid. What are these guys doing? They're trying to save themselves out of needing Medicaid if they can. So they've arrived at retirement with insufficient annuity income to get themselves free and clear of Medicaid. As a result, they need to try to save it to at least delay the reliance on it. And so these folks are saving too. Okay, so what's I think emerging here, I hope, is an important observation that at least was new to us, which is it really isn't so much the wealth level that dictates whether you need to save more or less. I mean, that's not unrelated, of course, because people with low income and low wealth are often people who are less annuitized, but it's this interaction and indeed this complementarity oftentimes between annuitized wealth and bequeathable wealth that leads to additional savings late in life. For many people, it's actually having a lot of annuitized wealth that induces the desire to save even more. Okay? So in that sense, the theory identifies what I would think of as three different types of households distinguished by their annuity income. It's the low-resource household who never really saves in good health and is very likely to take up Medicaid. There's what we would think of as this middle-class household whose annuity income is really not sufficient to avoid Medicaid, but then may save in order to escape Medicaid upon arriving at poor health. And then there's this top group for whom, Medicaid is really not relevant. They're never going to take it up, but they may also save late in life, again, to, take advantage of the additional marginal utility of consumption that will occur upon arriving in low health. And annuity income is really key here for two reasons. It's key because, of course, it's illiquid. You can't borrow from future annuity income. You can't say, look, I've become sick. I want to bring a lot of that future annuity income forward because I need it right now. That's not possible. And the second important issue, especially for these folks who anticipate relying on Medicaid, is it's taxed. It's taken. Okay, so you don't get Medicaid and the consumption that it affords, and then also your annuity income. It's taxed away by Medicaid. Okay, so these two combined makes the level of annuitization really key in thinking about the incentives to save late in life. So, this is theory, obviously. These are qualitative statements that we made so far. And just very quickly, this is really just a numerical illustration. We've calibrated using sort of reasonable parameterizations and tried to hit perturba of NT and Ys in terms of the underlying wealth distributions. And, very short answers. If you look at these sort of quantiles of the wealth distribution, it's relatively easy with standard preferences to generate cohort levels that are at least even, if not rising. And rising, of course, is much more common at the top of the wealth distribution. And this is what it would look like in the aggregate. Okay. So that's just a very quick tour through this model and what it can accommodate. I'll encourage you to read the rest of the paper, where we study annuity demand by endogenizing the choice of the annuity level at retirement, where it turns out, again, it's relatively easy to induce for at least the bulk of the population what you would expect, which is they feel over-annuitized. They don't want to buy anymore. We can also study the determinants of accidental bequest, but again, I'll leave that for later discussion. So in my view, this would be a reasonable sort of summary of what we've done. We have this now, what I think, quite tractable life cycle model consistent with a variety of puzzles. And I think, most exciting to me about it is it really reveals things that I didn't understand very well before, which is this annuitization, either via Social Security or pensions, is really key in thinking about who saves and why late in life. And especially interesting, I think, for future work is that we see this interaction with interest rates, which you sort of touched on a little bit earlier. And what that says to me is there's going to be important interactions between interest rate policy, as we've seen recently, and the take-up of public programs. We see it in this model. So the relationship between what you can afford to save for the future, determined in part by interest rates, influences a lot your demand for Medicaid in the future. Okay, so keep interest rates very low, in an effort to boost the economy. The obvious concern is that's going to lead a lot of people in life who just see very little incentive to save anymore into these public programs like Medicaid. Okay, so that's a topic of future work. Thanks.